Hi, this is Jack Stanley. I wanted to talk about the health of the presidents. It's interesting. We've had 43 individuals who have been president at the time of this recording. Now, I know President Obama, in his inauguration speech in 2009, said he was the 44th individual to take the oath of office. That is not correct. He made a mistake there, and his speechwriters made a big boo-boo. They should have done a little research into that. We've only had 43 people who have been president. One person served in office non-consecutively. That was Grover Cleveland. He was our 22nd and our 24th president. I wanted to talk about health because health is a very important thing when it comes to the American presidency. It's an extremely stressful job. One thing that I find very important is the age and the health of the candidates and what their general physical condition is. One thing I also like to mention about older candidates is whenever there is an older candidate, take a look at their vice president, because you have a very good chance that they may become president. So always look at that. Now, we have had 43 individuals who were president. We're soon going to have 44 individuals. I'm not going to say men, because it might be a man or a woman at this point. We don't know. The election's coming up pretty soon. And I will tell you, the presidential election of 2016 is one of the most bizarre I have ever seen in my life. Maybe it takes the rank of the most bizarre I've ever seen in my life. Very interesting, very different, very unique. And you have two dinosaurs running for president. One has just turned 70. The other will be turning 69 shortly. So we've got two very old individuals. Now, I know in today's world, the age of 70 is not old. I know the age of 60 is the new 40. Well, I don't totally agree with that, I'll tell you, because it ain't true. Yes, we're not like we were years ago. I remember my grandfather. I remember my grandfather when he was my age. He was an old man. But I don't think of myself as an old man today. I'm mature, yes. But I'm certainly not an old person that's unproductive and can't do things. But I looked at my grandfather as kind of a doddering old fella. And I think that today we're a lot different. That still does not exempt us from the fact that age is age. And put under extremely high pressure, individuals that are 70 years of age are not going to fare as well as individuals who are 50 years of age. It's just a natural fact. Now, we have had many individuals who have been president. Many of them have not been the healthiest. George Washington was not a very healthy man. I mean, he nearly died in office several times. And by the time he left office in 1797, he was a very tired old man of 66. And he would be dead 2.5 years later. Another thing that comes to mind also is, go to the next person that is of question, and that would be Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was considered the first individual who would die in office. Everyone thought that would happen. It didn't. He also survived an assassination attempt. The fellow who tried to assassinate him, had two guns, fired both at the president. Both misfired. And then they had to protect the assassin from the president because he was swinging at him with his cane. Well, he survived, barely. Then you had William Henry Harrison, who was our 9th president. Harrison, ironically, studied to be a physician. Later he became a general, the Battle of Tippecanoe. And when he was elected president, he was 68 years of age. Nearly 68. And he wanted to show how robust he was. And so at his inauguration, which was a freezing, cold, rainy day, he did not wear a coat. He wanted to show how strong he was. And he gave the longest inauguration speech in history. He still holds the record by a wide margin. Well, he caught a cold, which turned to pneumonia, and he died 1 month into his term of office. So he holds 2 records, the longest inauguration speech and the shortest term of president. It's interesting, a fellow who was a physician would do something like that, but it was politics, which is a very different field. We had John Tyler, very robust. Interesting thing about John Tyler, let's just call him, in a interesting sense. I don't mean in a bad sense, because we have some people that are real problematic with keeping their pants on. But this is the stud of the presidency. He produced more children than any other president. And his last child would be born when he was 70. John Tyler. He actually has a grandson still alive. Possibly 2. I think there's only 1, though. Others, let's see, James K. Polk. He died a couple of months after leaving the White House. He was totally exhausted. Zachary Taylor was a tired old general. Couldn't handle all the stress. The interesting thing about Zachary Taylor is that when he was president, and this led to a lot of conspiracy theories, that the South was going crazy and the North was going crazy over every issue that would lead to the Civil War. However, this was 10 years before the Civil War, and all the old dinosaurs in Congress, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun, got together and created the Compromise of 1850, which was a band-aid, more or less, to stave off Civil War, which it did for about 10 years. Zachary Taylor looked at it and said, "I won't sign it. And if they want to have a war, let it happen." Well, everyone was terrified. Everyone was waiting for the Civil War to start. And then he died. And, well, everyone thought it was an assassination. He was actually exhumed in the 1990s to find out if indeed he was. And it turned out he was not. He ate cherries and lots of cold milk, got gastroenteritis, and it was just too much for his body, and he died. We had several other presidents in between there. You had Millard Fillmore, who did sign the Compromise of 1850. Very robust, very healthy. In fact, he was never sick. He was always very healthy until he died. Got sick and bang, that was about it. Franklin Pierce, very depressed, alcoholic. His wife was even more depressed than he was. Lost all their children. In fact, their son, Benji, was killed right in front of them in a train accident. Pretty awful. His wife died. Nathaniel Hawthorne was a good friend of him. They went out on a trip together and Hawthorne died. He finally just said there's nothing else to do but go home and get drunk, and that's what he did. James Buchanan wasn't much better. Heavy, heavy drinker. Used to drink J&B whiskey, actually. He liked it because it was his initials. And he ordered copious amounts of it and prided himself on the fact that he could drink a bottle of it and you wouldn't know he had been drinking. Something really to get very proud of, I guess. He was our first gay president. His partner was Senator King from Alabama. King would become vice president for Franklin Pierce. So he was our first gay vice president. We don't hear about this very often. Andrew Jackson was a miserable person. many respects. He liked to make fun of them. He called them Miss Nancy and Miss Fancy, and that's what he called Buchanan and King. Well, nonetheless, he didn't do very well as president. He was too old. Interesting thing about James Buchanan is they say his administration was socially successful and politically disastrous. And that's really true. I mean, it was a disaster, his presidency. The entire country fell apart. He was known as the doughface. Those were folks that supported slavery in the North. Yes, he did buy slaves and set them free, but he was terrified to challenge the South. He was too old. He was too tired. And all he did in the last year of his administration was drink and smoke cigars, basically. And when Abraham Lincoln came to visit him in 1861, he said, "Sir, if you're as happy to enter this place as I am to leave it, you are a very happy man." And then came Lincoln. Wow, when we talk about presidential health, few people were as screwed up as Lincoln. Let's just say it as it is. A brilliant man. Emotionally a mess. Depressed. Depressed beyond the descriptions of depression. He walked about with a sense of melancholy always. His friends sometimes were worried that he might commit suicide. I mean, in his younger years, they used to take all the knives out of the house so he wouldn't be able to stab himself. Very depressed man. In today's age, he wouldn't get elected. He'd probably have a hard time getting elected dog catcher in many respects because of his emotional condition. But he was brilliant. He was perfect for his time. Followed by Andrew Johnson and Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was a slight individual, small man. Kind of delicate in some respects. He went to West Point. His highest grades were in art at a military college. He didn't like the sight of blood. He would always order meat well done so he would never see blood. Very strange individual. Smoked like a fiend. He would die of cancer at the age of 63. Followed by Rutherford B. Hayes, healthy. James A. Garfield was an extremely robust and healthy individual in his later 40s. There was an assassination attempt on him by a fellow by the name of Guiteau, who was nuttier than a fruitcake. And Guiteau only slightly wounded President Garfield. Slightly. In 4 days, he could have been resuming his duties. That's how slight the wounds were. But then his doctors got a hold of him. And his doctors did not believe in this new fad called sterilization. Well, it took him 4 months, but they finally killed him. It's amazing. Excuse me, I'm wrong. It wasn't 4 months. It was July, it was September when he finally died, 2 months. Still, if you think about it, it's pretty incredible that it took them 2 months to finally finish off what Guiteau tried to do. They did it far more successfully. And Guiteau, before he was executed, said, "I didn't kill him. The doctors did." That was the most sane thing that fellow ever said. He was right, but they killed him anyway. Then he was followed by Chester A. Arthur, who's not a well man, died a year after leaving the presidency. Followed by Grover Cleveland. Robust, big, and fat. Served 2 non-consecutive terms. He's our 22nd and 24th president. Actually, he produced children until he was in his 60s, well into his 60s. His youngest child was Francis Cleveland. I remember Francis Cleveland. Yeah, he lived into his 90s. And then there in between Grover Cleveland was Benjamin Harrison, healthy, also produced a child well into his 60s. And then we come to William McKinley. William McKinley was, if I may put it this way, both his parents lived to old age, well into their 80s. And so he came from very, very long-lived, healthy stock, and he was a pretty healthy individual, hearty and fat, and corpulent, as they called it in those days. He was shot, of course. A few days afterwards, he would finally die from the effects of the surgery, because the surgery wasn't done well. There was no doctor nearby to do it. There was a gynecologist working with him. Also, the thing is that we always talk about McKinley as not getting any exercise. Well, he did get exercise. He did ride a horse. He did go for walks. And also, he had to take care of his wife, Ida, who was very sick, epileptic, and somewhat childlike. And most often in the evening, he would pick her up and carry her up the massive flight of stairs at the White House. So he would get his exercise every night doing that. So he was a pretty healthy individual. He died, and his vice president took over. Always watch out for the vice presidents. And that was Theodore Roosevelt, who was indeed a cup and saucer short of a full play setting. But I must tell you that Theodore Roosevelt was fine for his time. He was starring in a show called Me. I always liked what his daughter used to say. She said he liked to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, and the baby at every christening. That was Theodore Roosevelt. Or as Henry Adams used to say, that he talks too much. And when he talks, all he talks about is himself. It's 6 o'clock, by the way. Now, he was followed by William Howard Taft. He was somewhat healthy and somewhat monstrous. He was 350 pounds of president. And he was somewhat of a hypochondriac and kept a very detailed record of his health. Now, his two nemesis, if you think about it, especially in the election of 1912, were Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. And one would think that those two individuals, Theodore Roosevelt, who was the possessor of the strenuous life, and Woodrow Wilson, who was somewhat slight, would outlive 350 pounds of president. But that was not the case. Theodore Roosevelt portrayed the fact that he was amazingly healthy. He was pretty strong. He lived to be 60. It was all over. Taft would make it to 73. He would eventually live to see his greatest ambition was to become Chief Justice of the United States. He was finally appointed that in 1921. Never really wanted to be president. But he was our fattest president and one of our best dancers. Interesting thing, sometimes heavier set people turn out to be remarkable dancers. Well, he was. And then we have Woodrow Wilson, who never should have been president, a very sick man. Woodrow Wilson was just so sick. He had gone to many clinics, had many mini strokes, suffered from depression, hypertension. Just not a well man. And the United States suffered because of his health. He had what we think were mini strokes during his presidency. And then World War I came, and he was never right. It got worse as time went on. By the time we reach the end of World War I, he is going to Europe and negotiating the peace without anybody else, with no representatives from Congress or the Senate. In fact, no bipartisan action of any kind. And then he went and negotiated the peace and met at the Treaty of Versailles. He was sick, he was paranoid, he was nuts. You know, there's an old saying that a dry twig never bends, it breaks. And that's probably the best way to describe Woodrow Wilson. He was a dry twig. And when things changed and he needed to bend, it wouldn't happen. And he had a massive stroke. His wife became more or less the de facto president for a while. She deflected what would go to him or what didn't go to him. And he even had the audacity in 1920 to announce that he was ready to serve a third term. Nuts! Out of his mind completely. And when he was told that no one was interested, he just led off with a string of obscenities, and it showed there was nothing left. Just a frightening individual who just didn't understand how to negotiate. Followed by Warren G. Harding, another individual who's not healthy, had an enlarged heart, high blood pressure, had other issues health-wise, and he would be dead 2.5 years into his term. Followed by Calvin Coolidge, kind of a depressed man, especially after the death of his son. And he would die at the age of 60. Died of a heart attack. He was just a depressed, lonely man. Herbert Hoover, very lively, very strong, lived to be 90 years of age, as did, you know, it's an interesting thing, he was the first one to make it to 90 after John Adams. John Adams made it almost to 91 years of age. And Herbert Hoover was the first to make it to 90 again. Think about that spread, all those individuals in between. No one got close. And next, after Hoover, is Franklin Roosevelt, a man in a wheelchair, a man with polio, and a man who never told anybody that he couldn't walk. And he created the illusion of that. And actually, he walked with the aid of his son. And he would walk in front of people slowly. But he did it. That's an amazing thing. I mean, amazing will. Interesting, brilliant man. And he became more or less our Caesar. And when he died, we had a vice president that was woefully unprepared. Harry S. Truman. Lots of great things came from Truman, but so many disasters came from Truman because he just didn't know. He didn't understand it. He met Oppenheimer and said, never let that idiot in my office again, whatever he said. He wasn't happy about it because Oppenheimer told him that other people are going to get the atomic bomb, and he said, never happen. He was somewhat short-sighted and had horse blinders on quite often. And that was one of the problems with Harry S. Truman. But he was a healthy man. Dwight Eisenhower, tired, had a heart attack and a stroke in office and intestinal problems. Made it. Followed by a man, if anyone had known his medical history, would never even gotten through the first hoop of running for president. John F. Kennedy. He was on 18 different medications. Had a bad back, that's no big deal. Had Addison's disease, which could be a big deal. He suffered from a whole bunch of different problems. An amazingly strong individual. Don't mean physically. Strong, he was able to take an awful lot. He was in pain his whole life. And so in many cases, I have to say that maybe we were wrong in saying that he shouldn't be president. But, you know, he was one of our most influential presidents of the later years. Maybe what he did wasn't so, but what he said. And he had a way of inspiring us. I remember him. Lyndon Johnson, quite healthy. Heavy smoker. He would be dead just a few years after leaving the presidency. He had a very bad heart. He had several heart attacks. Following him was Richard Nixon. Quite healthy, but a very unhealthy psyche. He was paranoid, aggressive, bizarre, remarkably intelligent. I remember I asked Mike Wallace once in a conversation, I said, who is the greatest intellect you've ever seen? Without missing a beat, he said, Richard Nixon. He said, an incredible intellect marred by an imperfect personality. Very good description. After Nixon came forward, probably one of the best athletes we've ever had as president. I remember Gerald Ford. I met with him, and he was remarkably robust. And when I met him, he was 86 years of age, and he was ramrod straight. And I always remember, he told me he worked out twice a day and went swimming. He said, not bad for 86, huh? I said, not at all, Mr. President. What are you going to say? Anything else? He looked great, though, I must say. He would live to see 93 years of age. In fact, he's the longest lived president so far. That may be challenged very soon, because as I speak, we have a few former presidents that are getting close to that age. Now, Ford was followed by Jimmy Carter, who is still alive as I speak, and he is pushing very close to becoming the longest lived president. He was followed by Ronald Reagan, who did originally get the highest rating of the longest lived president, which was taken by Gerald Ford. Interesting to note, Ronald Reagan was very old, and he never should have served the second term, as far as I'm concerned. He suffered from the effects of Alzheimer's, and by the time he left office, he was certainly not in very good condition. He was followed by George Herbert Walker Bush, who was very, very healthy, remains so. He's still alive. He's also in the running for the longest lived president. Followed by Bill Clinton. Pretty healthy. Had some issues. He was a little chubby. He seemed to like McDonald's very well. And it was a whole big thing about trying to straighten out his health. He got into trouble. He was very much like Kennedy and a few others. He had a little trouble keeping his pants on, but he was pretty healthy. Followed by George W. Bush, who was very healthy, except when it came to pretzels. They were dangerous for him. But he is very much alive today, and followed, of course, by President Obama, who is in remarkably good health. Although he does smoke cigarettes. He's a closet smoker. But he appears to be very slender, very healthy, remarkable. I think he'll be around for a long, long time. And now we are ready for either Donald or Hillary. The election's coming in just a few weeks. I have my ideas on who is going to win, but I will stay silent on that because I think it's kind of interesting. You know, the whole objective of history is not to suggest what will be. It's to talk about what was. Therefore, I don't think historians should ever talk about what they expect. That's not really their area. Let those who are political pundits talk about that. But all I can say is, today's date is what? It's October 13th when I'm recording this. And I must say that there's going to be a lot of fireworks coming in the next few weeks as this extremely bizarre election takes place. Of two old dinosaurs, remember, look at the vice president. And I think, I'm not too far off in saying this, that as historians, we will be talking about this campaign very much over the next 100 years. Thank you very much. I thought I would just share some of these thoughts about presidential health and things. A little fireside chat, one might say. Have a good evening.